everybody. Ian is a founder and director of Oakbank Conservation Limited. Ian and Tim started the business 16 years ago. The team is now nationally all around the UK, giving advice and selling products to many estates, many farmers, and are doing very well within the elms, etc. Ian has a particular interest in cover cropping and is the particular go-to guru within Oakbank and also in the wider field. So if I could just hand over to Ian, he will give us his presentation. Ian, thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Can you hear me, Charlie, all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, hopefully everybody else can as well, and hopefully also you'll be able to see the screen okay now. So yeah, thank you very much. So my name's Ian. We've been based at Ellington, just outside Huntingdon, from 2005. As I say, we're mainly sort of started work with shooting and sporting estates, moving into the environmental stewardship world in its very many guises, countryside stewardship now, and potentially elms going forward, although what that's going to mean is fairly unclear. We're probably most well known for the game covers and the countryside stewardship seeds that we do, but we do get an awful lot of advice on those things as well as woodlands. We've got an excellent woodland team working in East Anglia and the East Midlands, and increasingly doing work on soil improvement covers, companion crops and so on. So the theme for tonight's talk was how does cover cropping fit into your farm business? So I thought sort of try and do a definition of a cover crop, and this is from the US Department of Agriculture, which is quite long-winded, but it mentions things like erosion control, soil structure, moisture, nutrient content, habitats for beneficial insects and biology, facilitating pollinators, forage for farm animals and so on. But fundamentally, in its simplest form, it just covers the soil. Now that might not be a terribly exciting function, but just by doing that, an awful lot of benefits are accrued. So why is that important for your farm business? Well, the soil is sort of the fundamental resource that you're using, and your farm's performance largely depends on that. And it also dictates much of the value of your farmland. So that's why grade 1 soil is more valuable than a grade 3, for example. I would say that decades of best practice have degraded many of our soils through both physical disturbance, so cultivation, ploughing and so on, but also chemical disturbance. That includes the pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, so on that go on, as well as the fertilizer. Now it's very important that you realise I'm not blaming anybody for that, because the reason it's called best practice, because in the day that's what it was. And you'll see a graph later that for a long time, that best practice has worked. It's increased yields, it's allowed us to produce lots of food very much more efficiently, but there have been unintended consequences of that. And in order for us to move forward and realise why we need to make some changes to what we're doing, we need to recognise that. But as I say, there's no blame attached to anybody. Certainly the farmers seem to be on the thick end of the blame from the public, but they need to understand why perhaps we've done certain things over the years, many of which were motivated by payments from the government. So they really wanted us to do it. And if we didn't do it, they paid us more to make us behave in the way they wanted us to. So one of the things I think is really important we understand is we haven't paid enough attention to the consequences for the biology within the soil, and how crucial that is for how the soil is structured and how that structure then allows things to function properly. And biology is crucial. We'll come back to that point in a moment. Certainly last winter, with the amount of rain that we had, it's shown that the soils are really not that well equipped to deal with the level of stress that they're now experiencing. And that can be in the form of too much rain, not enough rain, excessive heat if there's a drought and so on, but also the level of stress that comes from using increased levels of chemical inputs and fertilizers in order to sort of basically end up back where we used to being. So basically, the more prepared your business is to deal with stress of all its types, the more resilient it will be. And as we said at the beginning, the soil is the fundamental resource that you have that generates the profits for your business. Just quickly mention about climate change, and why that's important and why it affects this factor. As the climate changes, the weather patterns will change as well, and that seems to mean that we're going to have more, what's the right expression, more severe episodes. So when we get something, we'll tend to get a more severe version of it. So there'll be more rain, more heat, more wind, perhaps more snow. So you can expect more heavy downpours. And if you go back to that initial picture where we showed the ploughed field and the covered field, simply having that cover on the soil will do an awful lot of good. Because one of the biggest causes of soil erosion is the physical impact of raindrops on bare soil. If you imagine a raindrop hitting the ground at about 30 miles an hour, that can move quite a lot of soil. And if there's a lot of rain coming at once, that can put that soil into suspension. And it doesn't just carry the soil, that soil carries organic matter, it carries chemical residues, it carries fertilizer, and carries pesticides. And we want those things to stay in the field and do the job they're intended to do, not leave the field and cause problems for others. And the philosophy of the polluter pays is very much coming back into vogue, and looking at the agriculture bill, I think we might see more of that going forward. So it's likely that these new changing weather patterns will not be spread evenly around the globe, and we can't guarantee that we will get more rain or less rain. It'll change the weather patterns completely, and we're not clear at all on what exactly that will mean. But you should expect larger peaks and troughs, and that increases the stress and goes back to why the resilience is more important. And it's absolutely imperative that your soil is well structured and healthy so it can cope with those stresses. And one of the big things that cover crops can do is increase the rate at which soil can infiltrate water. There's a gentleman called Gabe Brown in America that I've spoken to, and he embarked on this journey about 10 years ago. And in that time, his soil went from being able to infiltrate ½ an inch of rain in an hour to being able to cope with 3 inches of rain in a minute. And that's a massive, massive change. And it also means that the soil can cope with that water, both in terms of draining too much away, but also storing it for later when it's dry and when it's needed. So this picture is a fantastic one. I found it on the internet and investigated what it was. But the green strip in the middle was, until about 2 years ago, a hedge line. So it hadn't been exposed to modern farming best practice. So it hasn't been cultivated, it hasn't had chemicals, it hasn't had fertilizer, it hasn't had pesticides. It's just been left there in its sort of natural state, if you like. Whereas the farmland either side's been all of those things and best practice of the day. But in an episode of drought, look what's happened. The area that was undisturbed and hasn't lost its soil organic matter to the same degree has held on much, much better. And I think that really shows when we say our farming hasn't really done too much to the soil. I think this picture demonstrates exactly what has happened and how important it is that we redress some of that balance. Other consequences that we see, both these pictures are from the UK, so we're getting rain erosion or rill erosion, even on relatively low gradients, because the soil isn't able to stand up and drain the water away. And obviously, any of you that are out on the fens probably familiar with fen blows. These are getting worse as the soil organic matter is degrading and going down, and we're not able to keep the soil in the field where it started. And also where people are growing more maize in fields where perhaps in the past it was thought not to be such a good idea. These late harvesting fields, particularly on clay soils, are leading to problems, and there are some good solutions to this, and I think we might well see legislation that basically doesn't allow fields where this is a potential problem to have just maize. I imagine they'll be insisting that we plant cover crops in between the rows, and that's been shown to work very, very successfully to stop this sort of thing happening. But this could also be stopped using something like a buffer strip, which you could be paid for under countryside stewardship. So there really is no excuse for this kind of thing still happening. But I think the biggest difference that you'll see to your business is being seen in your yields and in the combine tank and the lorries leaving the farm. This is the graph of the UK wheat yields from early 1900s all the way through to about 2015. And as you'll see, from 1970 onwards, when things like nitrogen fertilizer and so on were used, and more mechanization, more modern equipment and so on, this is what I mean by the best practice was working. Yields significantly increased, profitability increased, and we did very well out of it in those years. But you'll see from around about the mid-90s, that yield increase has been slowing down and pretty much flatlining. And that's so for about 20 years, those wheat yields have flatlined, and a lot of people would tell you that they're struggling to get up to those yields even now. And that's despite the best efforts of plant breeders. It's despite the technological improvements and new best practice, new techniques, advances in agronomy, bigger and better machinery. Now that's obviously helped efficiency in terms of how many hectares we can do in a day with more horsepower, etc. But have we also been creating a problem that we were trying to solve by using bigger machinery to try and force soils into submission and get them into a state where we can grow a crop? Now, the average of soil organic matter in this Earth Care review has declined from 3.4% to 2.8% in the last 15 years. And that's a really crucial change, because scientists have shown that below about 3.5% soil organic matter, soil is far more prone to what they call structural deterioration, because the organic matter is the thing that helps to form the soil aggregates, and that's what makes the whole of the soil more stable. So going back to why the soil is obviously so important for plant production and good profits and good growth, all of these functions are from the soil. So organic matter accumulation, supply of nutrients, charged surfaces, that's again part of the nutrient supply, transformation of contaminants and solving pollution problems, and so on. So regulation of water and draining excess water. So all of these are important soil functions that they provide to the plant. And these are the threats to those functions. So acidification, erosion, contamination, soil sealing, organic carbon loss, and so on. So all of these threats and how they work, and it's extraordinarily interlinked, which this graph shows. So if we're not dealing with these problems, the function of the soil for plant production will be significantly compromised. And we must make sure that the soil organic matter is the key thing that we're looking at, and making sure that, because that buffers a lot of these problems away, and we must make sure we're looking after that. So how do cover crops help with this soil structure? I can remember when I was at college at Harper Adams, we were learning always how roots basically took things from the soil and brought them into the plant. And it's only really in recent times that I've really learned how probably 60% of what the roots do is actually pump things out into the soil in order to make things happen which are for the benefit of the plant. And one of the products that the roots pump out is a sticky sort of carbohydrate substance called glomalin. What that does, it takes all the different particles within the soil and pulls them together in aggregates. Now these aggregates are much more stable, but between the individual pieces there are spaces, and those spaces hang on to nutrients, they hang on to water, they hang on to oxygen, they hang on to air, and so on. But they're really, really important that they stay stable. As soon as you don't have that going on, all of the individual particles are far, far more likely to be washed or blown away, as you'll see in a very sandy soil. I was up in Norfolk last week on a soil that was officially 95% pure sand, and it would be very, very difficult to improve that significantly. But we're still doing work there with cover crops to try and make that much less prone to blowing away. It says here on the diversity, and I think that's really important, because the thing that cover crops do for me that other things that you can use to improve soil organic matter, so things like animal manures, compost, those sorts of things. The thing that a cover crop does is it actually takes these nutrients and starts cycling them. So as I say, the roots are putting stuff out into the soil as well as taking stuff out, and different roots combine with different bacteria to do different jobs. And I think that's the really crucial thing, that is the difference between plant roots and their role compared to other perhaps more straightforward, simple and obvious choices for improving or increasing organic matter. So this is a really good example of what we're trying to achieve. Obviously the picture on the left hand side of the screen has got a really good structure. The roots have found it very, very easy to pass through. I'm sure you find a lot of worms in that soil, and it's going to hold a lot of water and a lot of nutrients, and it's doing very well. That's from a pasture field. And then the other one is, perhaps if I went out not very far from my office here in Huntingdonshire on one of the heavy clay soils, that would be more typical of what I'd find. So there's not that much aggregation. It's a fairly solid block. The roots would struggle to get down through it as much, and it's clearly not as much of what we're looking for as the sample on the left. So what are cover crops doing to improve that? Well, as I said at the beginning, they're simply covering the soil. So that's protecting it from the elements, from the sun and heat for a start. And you'd be surprised how important that is, even in our climate, but certainly in other parts of the world. Keeping the ground covered certainly regulates the temperature, and the temperature is really, really important for the biology. I've seen some examples where the difference between a cover crop and no cover crop is as much as 35 degrees Fahrenheit, comparing the two. And it can get to the point where biology can survive and where biology can't, because it can get well over 100 degrees when there's no cover on the crop. And it also, as you said earlier, about slowing the rain down, but it slows that impact down. It gives the soil a bit more of a chance to deal with it. And clearly, if you've got a cover like the one in the picture, there's not going to be any wind erosion from that at all. But the roots themselves are also playing an important part. They're physically penetrating the soil, and if you use a mix like the one in the picture, you'll have different types of roots doing different jobs. So this particular picture, we've got oats, we've got phacelia, we've got oil radish, and I believe there's also vetch in there as well. So you've got the phacelia, which is doing a really nice job in the top of the soil. The oats will be going down some way into the soil. The oil radish will be deeply penetrating with long tap roots and gathering up nutrient that might be still available and stop it leaching away. And the vetch is a legume, and that's going to be producing some nitrogen in the absence of some, and also doing a really nice job feeding the biology. So all of those things, again, the nutrient cycling is for me the most important one, as well as this penetrating the soil and allowing water and air to get into where the crop needs it. This is an expression that I picked up in the States. I've been really lucky to go over to the States the last 2 years to some conferences over there. And they've sort of got a lot more people doing this work, but it's a much bigger country with a huge range of challenges from north to south, all kinds of different weather conditions, soil conditions, and so on. And frankly, if we think we've got a biodiversity problem here, then people need to go to the Midwest of America, because it's really staggering how far you can travel and only see 2 crops growing, which are maize and soybeans. But over there, they talk about how biology will beat chemistry. It's really good to have a balance of the two, but you'll never create a good crop if you haven't got the biology there, and it doesn't matter how much chemistry you use. Plant health is really, really important, and it's plant health that increases soil health and not the other way around. You need healthy plants to improve the soil, and that biology is crucial for keeping the nutrients going to the plants. And on this next slide, you'll see a gentleman called John Kempf, who is a very interesting gent. He's from the Amish community in the States, but he's a really renowned agronomist over there, working with a huge range of crops from fruit to maize and soybeans. And he thinks that most cultivated crops are only delivering 15 to 40% of their photosynthetic and genetic potential. Now, can you imagine if we're getting to even say 10 tons of wheat, and that's only 40% of the potential? But what he taught us was that if plants are not in favourable conditions, they'll be doing everything they can by pumping root exudates out into the soil to try and improve that situation. So they're trying to feed the microbes that they know can create better conditions for themselves. So if they're short of maybe potassium, they'll be sending out a certain type of exudate that will encourage the biology that produces potassium to create that for it. And this has been shown to be true in lots of laboratory tests over in the States. It's a fascinating subject, and you can really get lost in it, but it's incredibly complicated. But the simple message is that if you keep your soil organic matter up, a lot of these things sort themselves out quite naturally. So I call this the photosynthetic wheel of good fortune. So if we can increase the photosynthetic efficiency by pumping out more sugars from the roots into the soil, we'll increase the biological activity within the soil, which is then feeding back the stuff that the roots need and creating efficient mineral absorption. That creates a healthier plant. And there's no question that a healthier plant has increased pest and disease resistance and better quality. If the plant is showing better pest and disease resistance, it will grow better and have increased photosynthetic efficiency again, and that's how the wheel drives itself around. So the more we can keep the plant healthy, the better it will do in every respect, including pest and disease resistance, which was a long conversation I had with him about cabbage stem flea beetle. But his view is we should be able to make all crops resistant to all pests and all diseases through nutrition. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet with that. I'm not sure I feel quite as strongly as that, but certainly there's a lot of truth in keeping plants healthy will make the chance of them getting sick or attacked by pests much less likely. So by increasing the photosynthetic efficiency, we're increasing yields and profits. And that's really why I believe cover crops are important to your business, because they will drive increased profits down the line. That can be from savings and from increased yields. So do they work? Well, I certainly believe they do. I've seen lots of evidence to back me up in that belief. They're really well proven, and I would say to back up that proof, there are companies like water companies and so on who are prepared to pay their money to stop some of these things happening, because for them it's much better to pay you some money to stop the problems occurring by stopping it in the field rather than have to deal with it afterwards. And we're working with a number of water companies on these cover crop projects because they really do believe they work. They certainly prevent soil erosion by keeping the soil in the field where it started. They definitely increase water infiltration, storage and drainage. And if you ever get the chance to see the rainfall simulator, you can look it up on YouTube, but it really does demonstrate very clearly how that works. They do improve the soil structure. By using some crops, you can certainly provide additional grazing above and beyond the benefits for your arable crops. They feed biology and they can suppress the weeds. And certain things like oil radish and mustards can suppress nematodes. Legumes will increase nutrients, and things like oil radish and daikon radish can capture nitrogen very efficiently. So I've put this picture of myself in the crop really so you can see this crop is only 8 weeks old. And that's the kind of capacity that these things have to grow in the summer months. If you imagine that leaves are effectively solar panels, they're capturing that sunlight during very long periods of sunshine. And normally after harvest, we've got bare land for 8 or 10 weeks. And that's one of the longest periods of sunlight availability in the whole year. And we've been wasting it by not having these crops doing a job for us. So they can be scavenging nitrogen, fixing nitrogen. Things like buckwheat can mobilize phosphate. We can provide, as you can see here, there's got quite a lot of sources of nectar and pollen. Many of those species will go on flowering until you destroy the crop or until the first frosts. You have deep tilling roots, which will go much deeper than any cultivator I've ever seen. I've seen roots down to 1.5 meters. They'll condition the soil in the top so you get a nice till, and they can suppress weeds by taking space away and not giving them room to grow. I think legumes are really something that people should consider as long as it fits in with their rotation and they're not following closely with things like peas and beans in their cash crop rotation. Legumes are really fantastic for both the soil biology and the general health. And you can show here that in 8 weeks, these vetch plants were starting to produce nodules, which are nitrogen. And that will be given back to the crop when the crop is either very stressed or destroyed. If you're looking to think how much seed you want to use in a mix, I always sort of use this as a rough guide, but my basic philosophy is I would rather have more variety of species than kilos. So if you're working to a budget, I'd rather cut the total kilos down than take out ingredients if I possibly can. So you look at what percentage of the crop, individual crops you'd like to see in the mix, and you look at the sort of percentage you want to see and take that percentage of a normal seed rate. And if it's a bit too much, if it's starting to cost too much, cut that rate down a little bit. But certainly less is more in terms of kilos, but I really want to keep the variety up in terms of the species and the different crop families. I think that's really certainly proven to me over time, that's really worthwhile. You might be surprised to think I'm in favour of this, but I really am in terms of home safe seed, because these mixes certainly have a finite value to you, and if you can produce some of the bulk ingredients yourself on the farm, you can really make much better mixtures for the same kind of cost per hectare. But I wouldn't bother trying to be really clever and grow some of the sort of slightly wilder ingredients like radishes and phacelia and that kind of thing. They can be quite tricky, but really good choices that you could grow for yourself, things like beans and peas. Linseed is a really good one, oats and possibly buckwheat. We're trying to grow that this year, but you know, if you're familiar with growing linseed and oats and things like that, they can be terrific. My problem as a seed merchant is I'm only allowed to sell you certified seed, which is necessarily expensive in order to pay plant breeders and so on. But linseed, for example, I would love to use perhaps 10 kilos a hectare in a mix, but if you're using certified seed, that starts to make the crops very expensive. So that's the sort of thing where home safe stuff is really effective at bringing the budget down. This is an example of one of our summer cover crops at College Farm in Somersham, just near St Ives. This is an 8 species mix, and it left the ground really, really nice. And strangely, we were quite surprised at the effect it had on the blackgrass following. There was almost none in this patch. It's about a 2 hectare piece, but it did a really nice job, left the soil in fantastic condition, and we sprayed it off and direct drilled into this piece. For an overwinter cover crop, so that's something perhaps you might follow with spring barley or perhaps spring beans, those sorts of things. It's quite important to have some winter hardy elements in there, because you never know with our weather. We could have a fairly significant frost in November or something like that, so you want some stuff that is reasonably winter hardy, so that's going to provide that cover and structure going through the winter. But not everything in the mix needs to be like that, but certainly some of it does. Make sure you've thought about the rotation that you're using, and make sure you're not going to cause any conflict. So things like vetches before beans, currently it's not thought that's a good idea, although people are finding they're having some success planting some legumes before other legumes, but at the moment it's not something I would tend to do. For an overwintered one, clearly you've got good opportunities to grow something with grazing potential, so forage rye, vetch, and perhaps put some radishes or even some turnips in there would be good. Consider when you're going to terminate the crop and how far before the next crop that's going to be. On typical heavy soils in this area, I'd say at least 6 weeks in the winter. Glyphosate takes quite a long time to work in the winter. So a typical mix might be oats or rye with vetch, phacelia and radish. That'd be quite a nice mix going into the winter. We mentioned termination, or how you're going to kill this off. In my view, if we lost glyphosate, which is certainly possible, life will get much more difficult, but not impossible, but definitely more difficult. And I think it's a really useful tool while we have it. There are 4 other ways. Obviously, winter kill, if we can use crops like buckwheat and perhaps Bersian clover, which is relatively easy to kill. Chemicals like glyphosate. Mechanical, so that can be things like crimper rollers that we'll see in a minute, or even ploughing. But grazing is a fantastic way of taking the green cover down, processing it, and turning it into something much more useful. But it also helps to get the crop off the field, allows the surface to dry out. And we saw some very impressive yield benefits of having that done at College Farm when we were trying these things out. And you might think of a combination of the above, so possibly graze it first, and then if you're worried about grass weeds, still use a dose of glyphosate to clean those up. But grazing animals are a real catalyst for getting those improvements much more quickly. As you mentioned, herbicide timing is really important. I think, as I say, I'd rather go too early than too late, because even if you do kill off the crop a little bit early, you'll still have those roots and the structure that's produced in the soil still holding the things together. But not getting on early enough and having a fairly thick, wet crop when you're ideally wanting to plant your crop for combining, that can be quite detrimental to the yield. Use plenty of water in a big crop and give it plenty of time, and if grass weeds are present, you may need to back it up again. The picture at the bottom is of a roller crimper, which we're starting to see here. They're very popular in America, where they use a lot of forage rye as their cover crop, particularly before maize. And in that situation, it works very well. I think the jury's out a little bit in this country. If you're roller crimpering it onto a wet soil in the spring, I'm not sure quite how effective it will be with some things, but certainly there are people in this region that are trying them out, and they have had some success. And also using a Cambridge roll on a very hard frost in the night, that can work tremendously well, as long as we get a sort of -3, -4. But relying on the weather is a fairly dodgy thing to try and do. So these are the magic ingredients, if you can find any. If you don't have to have them yourself, you can get people on. But as I said before, by using these to process the crop, they can turn the material into manure very quickly and get the crop down. As you see here, they've cut it down fairly effectively in helping the soil surface dry out in preparation for drilling. So just to show you what you can achieve, this is a cover crop at Somersham, and I swear to you, this is what it looked like the day we drilled it. This had actually been sprayed off with glyphosate the day before, and we had a group of about 30 farmers standing behind me and behind Joe Redmond, who was driving this. It was a Sky drill that we used, and I was seriously worried that I was going to end up with massive egg on my face, and this was going to be a complete mess. When we drilled the field, we were drilling it into radish roots. It looked completely wrong. However, 8 weeks later, it looked like that. I think anybody would be fairly happy. The interesting thing for me to note is how the beans and so on have completely disappeared, but how the white straw is still there and still behind. So it just shows that the sort of more green foragey type crops do desiccate because they're largely water, and the straw takes time. But you'll find as your soil health builds up, the straw gets digested far quicker than you could ever imagine, and you'll start to see these little worm middens where the worms have piled up the straw in little piles above their burrows. As I say, that turned into a fantastic wheat crop. Really, really happy with it, and I wasn't quite as embarrassed as I thought I was going to be. So really, sort of the take-home message is that the soil is the main resource of producing profit, and cover crops are a really important, useful tool in making sure that remains the way. Trying to keep soil organic matter will buffer out a lot of these things, and just help to keep you on the right side of the line in terms of your soil's effectiveness as a growing medium. But don't underestimate basic things like field drainage. I've often been to fields and they've been really badly waterlogged, and the farmer wants to use a cover crop to try and solve it. We go to the edge of the field and the field drains are not being cleaned out, and it's just a complete mess from basic principles. So don't forget about those things first. They're really, really important. It's important to also realise that the rate of decline and the effect on your bottom line will accelerate as your soil organic matter is lost, because these problems of soil aggregation and so on become worse rapidly as the soil organic matter goes down. And with climate change being pretty clearly, it's happening, unless you're Donald and you don't believe into these sorts of things, it really is going to make more challenges and opportunities for us, because climate change is becoming a market that farmers can use in terms of being paid for things like carbon storage, and natural capital, which I'm sure you've heard that term. We haven't really got time to go into that tonight, but pay attention to that, because opportunities for those sorts of markets are really coming at us, whether they'll be in ELMs or whether, as I think and I hope, they'll be available from private sources. There really are opportunities there for farmers. And I'm not talking about rewilding. I'm really not. I like working with farmers who are growers and producers of food. Rewilding is fine. You know, it has its place, limited place, but I just think that you know, we have to work with farmers who are producers, and we've got lots of examples where we've got really good, profitable, productive farms with really profitable, productive environmental crops around those farms. And cover crops can be that. You can be paid for cover crops within environmental stewardship. You can be paid for cover crops by water companies, as I mentioned earlier, and they really are helping to sort soils out remarkably quickly. You'll hear some people say, oh, it takes 1,000 years to create an inch of soil. Well, I think that's nonsense, because you can turn poor soil into good soil in a matter of a few years, and that to me is creating soil, rather than, you know, something that is really just nothing more than dirt. I would say that the best experience for you is to try these firsthand on your own farm with your own kit and see the benefits for yourself. The first thing you need to do is not to buy a new drill or a new piece of equipment. There are plenty of opportunities to use contractors. There are several really good ones in this area who have direct drills and so on. And you can use a lot of these cover crop mixes with equipment you've already got. The smaller seeds will be able to be broadcast fairly effectively, and then either just harrowed in or rolled in. We're looking at ways of introducing them into the crop before combining, so using things like pneumatic spreaders and so on. But you know, try a bit on a small scale on your own farm and see what you think and how you get on. Understand that cover crops are not a thing, it's a topic, and they are like a box of tools. And you need to know the problem. You're in the same way that you don't need a screwdriver to turn a nut, you need a spanner. You need to use the right tool to deal with the problem that you're trying to achieve. So you'll only know if you've made a difference if you know what that difference you're attempting at the outset. But there's lots of help available locally. We certainly help, very, very happy to. A lot of agronomists are looking at this area, and those of you that are on Twitter will see there's a group of farmers in this area that are really keen and trying all sorts of things out with different techniques and so on. But don't just take one person's word for it. Twitter's great for seeing people who are very, very certain about things. And I would say with this that I've seen really strong effects in 1 year. And then when you look more deeply into the reasons for that, you realise why the next year the same thing doesn't happen. So things like herbicide residues and so on, weather conditions at planting time, they can make real effects on how successful these crops are. But we're getting excellent results. People that have been working with us for 3 or 4 years, they're all growing more and more. We've got a number of people who have got over 1,000 acres of cover crop on their farm, and they wouldn't be doing that. They haven't jumped into that straight away. They've built up to that, and they wouldn't be spending that sort of money if they saw it as a cost. They very much see it as an investment, and getting good results with it. So that's really all I've got to say for the time being, but I'll be really happy to take any questions. Charlie, have you been keeping an eye on things?
Yes, I have, Ian. We've got 1 or 2 just coming in. I think if I can just start one off, Ian, and perhaps if James, if you can start people's video cameras again. Ian, you've talked quite a lot about the economics, but you haven't really given us very many specific figures. When I go to see a client and I'm trying to persuade them to use cover crops, is there any, have you got much work that you've done on the economic value per hectare of cover crop?
There was an excellent course that was done by NIAB or NIAB TAG. I went on it 2 or 3 years ago, And the figures that they came up with, and what they'd done is they'd reviewed a lot of trials from lots of different people and sort of simulated all the results. And at that time, they were saying that the cover crop generally returned a value of £50 per hectare in the year immediately afterwards, and then another £50 in the year after that. So the value of these things is quite difficult to really pin down, because the benefits are not just immediate. It's not. I hear some people talking about cover crops. They say, "Oh, this crop will return 30 kilos of nitrogen." Well, we all know that we don't operate generally in a greenhouse. We're outside. So what a crop will do will depend largely on when it's drilled, how long it's been in the ground for, the weather conditions, whether they're helpful or not, and so on and so forth. So I'm not particularly one for saying, you know, it will return this many kilos of nitrogen or whatever. But certainly what we're trying to do is change the direction of the soil organic matter and the structure in the soil. But the figures I've always sort of worked to, as to say, they've been the NIAB tag ones, which were, it equated to about £100 a hectare that it was benefiting from, compared to where they weren't used. But that was over 2 years, so £50 in the first year and £50 in the year after.
Thanks, Ian. Have we got any questions from anyone else out there, please? Okay, I've got another one for you, Ian. You mentioned towards the end and through your talk about carbon, and we heard from Richard at the beginning that we're going to have a legal responsibility to be carbon neutral by 2050, and you kind of alluded to private funding for carbon. Can we use cover crops for carbon sequestration, do you think, moving forward?
Certainly in other countries like the United States, this is a very sort of fast moving and fast developing market. There are a number of companies and active markets over there already where they are paying people to do exactly that. So there are basically two models. One is where they're using a model called the Comet Farm, and that's based on they're paying you to modify your production system, and depending on where you are, their model will work out what your change of system is worth in terms of improved carbon storage in your soils, and they'll pay you for that. And then another system is where you undertake the activity, and then the soil is then tested, and you're granted carbon credits, which you can then sell on a market. And I've spoken to a number of people over there. There's a company called Indigo Ag, who are undertaking a thing called the Teraton Initiative, which is more widespread than just simply cover crops, but cover crops are certainly a big part of that. Over in the States also, they've got companies like General Mills and Wrangler Jeans and others who are offering their growers more per unit of production if they're using regenerative agriculture methods. So this sort of thing is being driven by the consumer, because they're wanting to buy products which are produced in a more environmentally friendly way, and these markets are developing all the time. I'm not sure in the UK that there's one just yet, but I believe we'll see that start to come on stream in the next year or two for sure.
Thanks for that, Ian. Ian, we've got a question from Ted Holmes. Ian, given the area you're covering from Ellington, are you seeing any specific benefits from given mixtures on certain soils?
Certainly, in terms of the job we're trying to do, where we're working for water companies, they're largely, actually that's not true, in the Anglian region, they have very much a nitrate focus. So they're very keen on things like oil radish at reasonably high levels, because there's good science to show that oil radish is a very successful crop in terms of hoovering up free nitrogen in the soil and stopping it leaching away. As I said earlier, the cover crop really is a box of tools, so we need to know what you're trying to do before we produce a mix for that. But if you're looking for something to sort of deeply penetrate the soil with roots, then things like black oats are very good, oil radish and daikon radish. If you're trying to improve the soil structure in the top of the soil, vetches and phacelia are very, very good. Linseed is a particular favourite of mine, and years ago, I worked for a seed company where we grew a lot of linseed seed crops. And we always found that the fields afterwards were very, very sort of high in their worm numbers. And when you look at the rooting style of a linseed plant, I was looking at some the other day, and the plants above the ground were about 8 inches long, and the roots were probably 10 inches long. And even in a relatively short space of time, it roots very deeply. And I think they form these sort of structures that worms particularly like and follow down. So if you're trying to improve those, obviously counting worm numbers is quite a simple tool for you. If you want to go on this journey of improving your soils, they're quite a good indicator and something simple that you could do perhaps with your kids or your grandkids. And you know, it's a really good thing to do at the start before you've done too much, so you know where you've come from, and then you can know where you've gone to and see the differences. And also take some photographs of the soil, because the colour will really change as well. It'll generally go a darker colour, and it's often you can't remember, but having that sort of photographic record. And I have to say, it's been really good this year with people doing these cover crops through the summer, often through times when they would much rather have a crop of wheat in the field, but circumstances didn't allow that. But they've really taken some interest in the pollinators, the butterflies, the bumblebees, and all those sorts of things. And camera phones are great for recording this sort of stuff, and they're really useful also if you're trying to make a change. But make sure you start at the beginning. Make sure you record where you started from, so you know where you've gone to. Does that answer your question, Ted? So not sure I gave you too many examples, but certainly, let's say black oats are very good for deep rooting with linseed and radish. Phacelia for the top of the ground, and vetches as well. Buckwheat has a reputation for being able to extract phosphate from the soil. It actually gives out an acid from its roots, which are known to be able to actually extract phosphate from bare rock. But a lot of the times we don't really give these things time to really do an awful lot of that. But you know, the nutrient cycling, these combinations of plants together, is where I'm really seeing the benefits. Not 1 or 2 species, but 6, 7, 8 species. And in the States, where probably more things are possible and more varieties are available, some people over there are using 20 different species, all at relatively low rates, but they're getting fantastic results, particularly where they're grazing them. And one thing I would like to see over here is people using more kind of what they refer to in the States as warm season grasses. So that's things like millet and sorghum. And I have seen some people, and we have done some ourselves, where crops have been able to be planted in late July and early August. And millet in particular, I think, has got real promise, because it certainly has a good association with a lot of mycorrhizal fungus. You got any other questions, Charlie?
We've got no more coming in just at the moment, Ian, but I think we're sort of approaching 8 o'clock, and rather than take up too much more of anybody's evening, I'd just like to say thank you very much from the East of England Agricultural Society to you, Ian, and to everybody who's taken part. Thank you very much for your time and enthusiasm. Sounds like the take-home message from Ian is you need to just measure where you started from. And there was last year before at cereals, a rash of people burying their pants to see how long they took to break down within the soil. So I can see we're all going to be moving further in the direction of cover cropping, and we certainly are at home, and Oakbank have been very good in helping us deal with some of the issues we've got in front of us. So I think if we can all, in whichever way you can, say a big thank you to Ian, and that concludes this evening, unless there's any further questions.